Mr. Chairman, this is a very important amendment. The
amendment's been important and everyone's been simple, so we got that.
That's what we've been trying to point out, but I don't know, you all aren't, you're sitting on your hands over there. This administration's immigration policies are extraordinarily harmful and traumatizing, and the bill would increase that harm immensely, giving ICE a $45 billion slush fund for detention. Just to put that into context, ICE's annual budget for immigration detention is less than $3.5 billion. So this is a massive increase, and the increase alone is bad, but I just want to point out something very important, which is that the policy changes that the majority is trying to slip into their so-called funding bill are even worse. So my amendment would strike the provision that allows for families to be detained indefinitely. This provision would overturn the Flores Settlement Agreement, which has helped protect children in government custody for nearly 30 years. The Flores Settlement Agreement's principal purpose is to ensure that children are released from immigration detention as quickly as possible, recognizing the harm to children. Children in the custody of the DHS have to be placed in the, quote, least restrictive setting, and they are not allowed to be detained for more than 20 days. But this bill actually makes a very important policy change, and it gets rid of that requirement. It allows families to be detained throughout their immigration proceedings through their removal if they're ordered removal. But with the immigration court backlog, that means that families could be stuck in detention for years. Now, family detention has historically been used only for arriving families. But now, Trump is incarcerating families who have already been living in our communities as friends and neighbors for years. One of the youngest children being detained is only 1 year old. 1 year old child being put into detention. That is unacceptable, especially considering that much of the families detained under this provision and much of the new money provided for immigration detention is going to go straight to private for-profit prison companies. For-profit, privately owned prison companies are incentivized to make as much money as possible, often at the expense of the health and protection of individuals forced into their care. Private immigration detention facilities lack necessary oversight, they're often unsafe, and time again, that has led to a lack of sufficient health care and resources for detained individuals. Some of the most egregious abuses that we hear about of immigrants happen in detention facilities that are run by these for-profit private companies. Unnecessary medical interventions, forced labor, abuse of solitary confinement, and intimidation have run rampant. You might remember a case in Georgia, Mr. Johnson was with me when we went to visit, where immigrant women were being forced into sterilization procedures. Experts hired by the DHS office, that detention center, by the way, we were able to shut down thanks to our advocacy.
What's going on, Patriots? This is Conservative Chronicle, where we tell it like it is. Today, we're reacting to a recent congressional hearing where Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal went on a full-blown rant about ICE detention funding, attacking Republicans, private prisons, and basically every attempt to enforce immigration law. Let me just say this up front. This is a kind of grandstanding that's been undermining the rule of law in this country for years. So let's break down exactly what happened and why the left's crocodile tears don't hold up under real scrutiny. Jayapal goes on and on about how ICE detention funding is going from $3.5 billion to $45 billion. She calls it a slush fund. Well, here's the truth. It's not a slush fund. It's about finally giving our immigration system the resources it needs to secure the border, enforce the law, and stop the chaos. We're seeing record numbers of illegal crossings. Our border agents are overwhelmed. ICE can't do its job when it's underfunded. And instead of helping solve the problem, the left wants to defund ICE while screaming about trauma and profit.
Experts hired by the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, an office that the Trump administration closed without any congressional input or consent, conducted secret inspections of these detention facilities. Their investigation contains over 1,600 pages detailing conditions in these facilities, which they describe as, quote, barbaric and negligent. Private prison companies owe their first duty to their shareholders, not to the people they detain. They prioritize profits over people and care, and that is clear from a recent report in which medical experts determined that 95% of in-custody deaths that ICE reported between 2017 and 2021 were actually preventable. And of the 15 immigration detention centers with the highest number of deaths during this period, 13 are run by private prison companies, including a facility near my district, the GEO-run Northwest ICE Processing Center. I'm sure it's a total coincidence, but in 2024, GEO Group's PAC gave nearly $4 million to Republican campaign groups. And they're poised to make hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money from the bill's detention expansion. The Flores Settlement Agreement has guided our government's policies for detaining children for over a quarter of a century. And I want to be clear about what it looks like for kids before. When the Flores case was filed in 1985, children were held in indefinite detention in poor conditions without access to basic medical treatment. They were handcuffed, they were strip searched, subjected to body cavity searches, and required to sleep in areas and share bathrooms with adults that they didn't know. I can't imagine that that's something that anyone on this committee would want, and I would ask for the support of our Republican colleagues to prevent the overturning of Flores. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I wholeheartedly endorse Representative Jayapal's amendment. Anyone who has worked with kids who've been caught in the immigration system, anyone who has met children who've been held even briefly in a detention center know how much damage that does to these children, lifelong trauma. We've heard testimony before this committee in the past when there were efforts to detain children in violation of the Flores Agreement. So we can just go back to this committee's own records and testimony from Homeland Security officials. This is not something that the United States of America should ever be a party to, and so I would urge adoption of this amendment.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes,
I just have a question. I'm wondering if you think that everyone on the committee has actually read this bill, because this is a policy provision that's being slipped in as as part of a funding bill. And I'm just curious whether you think our colleagues on the other side have read. I mean, none of them are talking tonight, otherwise I would yield to anybody on the other side to answer that question.
That sounds like it could be problematic on the Senate side with the bird rule.
Well, exactly right. I think that there's a really important question about what happens in the Senate, but I would just urge I can't believe any of my colleagues on the other side would want to detain kids. I don't know if anyone over there wants to respond. Doesn't seem like anybody is talking tonight.
I think
Mr. Van Drew is looking like he really wants to, but he is trying to sit on his hands. Mr. Van Drew,
Van Drew has never stayed this quiet for this long.
No, I mean...
Chairman's got to buy me a drink for this one.
Well, I want to come back to just the serious question of whether you all think that kids should be detained. Because the Flores Agreement has existed for decades, and it existed specifically because we had kids who were being handcuffed and strip searched and subjected to body cavity searches and required to sleep in areas and share bathrooms with adults that they didn't know. And I'm thinking that, because I'm the eternal optimist, that maybe some of you over there don't want to vote for that and would vote with me on my amendment to make sure that we do not overturn the Flores Amendment in this, and that we actually preserve this important agreement. I don't know, Ms. Scanlon, it's your time, but I'll yield back to you. But I don't know if there's any other way to get people over there to answer the question about whether they've actually read the bill.
Well, and I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what is the Flores Agreement. The Flores Agreement came out of a lawsuit about what was appropriate treatment for children.
That's right.
And it was a way of the U.S. dealing with the fact that the treatment that was being afforded to children before the Flores Agreement was unconstitutional, was a serious violation of not just their rights, but of their physical and mental health. I mean, the testimony that we've heard about children being held in inappropriate situations that are not appropriate for anyone, but much less a child. Again, it is just not something that I think the United States of America should be party to.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Because there's an additional problem on top of this, which I think Ms. Jayapal very incisively got to, which is that by increasing the budget for immigration detention, I think you said from $3.5 billion to $45 billion, what is clear is our government does not have anywhere close to enough prison beds to use all that money. So that money designated for immigration detention of children is going to be outsourced to private prisons. So children are going to be indefinitely imprisoned in private prisons built for profit with substandard conditions, certainly not at all prepared for children or organized and arranged and oriented for children. And so we have so many multiple levels of problems here with this bill that this amendment would solve, which I think is very important for us to consider. I yield back.
Mr. Chair.
Time of the
My time expired.
gentlelady. Gentlelady from Vermont is recognized.
I move to strike the last word. I yield to my colleague from Pennsylvania. I'm just getting tired. Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to note, I think Mr. Goldman has raised a really interesting point. To the extent that this billion and billion of dollars of slush fund then becomes available to fund private prisons through companies like GEO, isn't this another instance where we may have to start monitoring our colleagues' stock purchases? Because I think I recall that once these executive orders started going into effect, we started seeing more stock purchases by our colleagues across the aisle of GEO and these other.
Yeah, and then another one, if I may
Yes.
request the time, is Palantir, which is a large tech company that was started by some of the supporters of the president who are close with other billionaires who've been put in the administration and clearly are advising the president on just about everything. And a certain member of the Republican Party from Georgia purchased Palantir stock, and as I understand the fact pattern, I could be wrong. That's why we have due process, because I would not be the one who would determine whether this is right or wrong. A couple weeks after making this purchase, this Palantir company entered into a $30 billion agreement with the Department of Homeland Security. This Republican member from Georgia sits on the Homeland Security Committee, which is the committee that oversees the Department of Homeland Security, which entered into this $30 billion. My understanding is that last check, that stock had increased by 48% since that deal was announced. And so since we have a slush fund going from $3.5 billion to $45 billion that will almost all go to private prisons, certainly this is something we would need a strong inspector general to oversee, right? To make sure that the Department of Homeland Security is not procuring that money in any wasteful, fraudulent, or abusive way. Is that your view as well, Ms. Scanlon?
Absolutely. I mean, the combination of the possibility that the money would go to those kind of private interests that have been so, making all those donations to the president and his inaugural fund and everything, or funding more placements in El Salvador or other inhumane prisons. I think for all those reasons, we should be cutting off this funding.
And may I ask another question? You mentioned the funding for the El Salvador prisons. I assume that you're referring to the fact that this administration is using taxpayer money to pay for El Salvador to house undocumented immigrants who were removed from our country without any court appearance and without any due process. And one of them, as we all know, has gotten a lot of attention, is Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The reason he's gotten a lot of attention is because there was a withholding order on his deportation order that specifically said he could not be deported to El Salvador because there was a legitimate fear of persecution if he were sent to El Salvador. And he was sent there. My understanding is the administration admitted that he was sent there in error. I think they called it a mistake, quote unquote. And the courts all the way up to the Supreme Court have ruled that it was a violation of the fundamental right to due process. And the Supreme Court said that the administration must facilitate his return. And Ms. Scanlon, my question for you, since you mentioned the payment, the taxpayer money that is going to pay for Mr. Abrego Garcia to stay there is, would it qualify, in your view, to facilitate if the administration told El Salvador that they would not pay for Mr. Abrego Garcia to stay there anymore?
That would seem to make sense, and it would certainly be consistent with the reporting we're seeing that it's not consistent with the conditions that even the El Salvador government had agreed to in that case. So I thank the gentlelady for the time.
Gentlelady's time has
I yield
expired. Gentlelady from California is recognized.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word. I would like to continue to engage in this questioning, and I have a question for the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. You know, in California, there are actually instances where dozens, maybe even hundreds of unaccompanied minors are in detention centers. And in fact, you know, we have been told, although the federal government is being very evasive in allowing us access, but we have been told that they've been trying to force cities, my city, to continue to hold these young children. And I don't believe they have been provided access to representation. Welfare checks are not being allowed. There's no kind of adult supervision of these young children. And so I was just wondering, concerned that this administration is trying to force cities and states into collusion with it, with this illegal, unconstitutional, and dangerous behavior, especially when we're talking about young children. And can you talk about, you know, how really disastrous this would be for the country, and why supporting your kind of amendment would allow folks to stand up to what this administration is doing when it comes to young children? And I'm so curious about this because in the first term of this administration, they seem to not want to continue to show images of children in cages, and yet they are still doing that to young children, but they don't want anyone to talk about it.
You know, I think we've talked quite a bit about what happens when you are detaining children, when you're not providing them with the appropriate supports, mental health supports, food, clothing, and emotional support. I mean, it's the kind of thing that the International Treaty on the Rights of the Child, which almost every nation in the world has affirmed except for the United States. It's the kind of thing that is designed to prevent so that we are not damaging children who aren't able to fend for themselves.
Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back the question.
Let's be clear. This isn't about cruelty. This is about law and order. If we don't enforce our immigration laws, we don't have a country. And pouring money into detention facilities is about capacity, not cruelty. Jayapal spends half her speech crying over the Flores Settlement agreement. For those who don't know, that's a 1997 court decision that limits how long minors can be detained, basically forcing us to release families into the country with a court date years down the line. You know what that's called? A catch-and-release loophole. And guess who exploits it? Cartels, smugglers, and criminals. They know that if they show up with a kid, even if it's not their own, they'll be released into the U.S. with virtually no consequences. This bill would close that loophole and let ICE detain families together until their cases are resolved. That's not inhumane, that's common sense. But the left wants us to just open the gates, hand out court dates, and hope people come back years later. Then we get to the left's favorite punching bag, private prisons. Jayapal starts blaming private detention centers for everything from bad food to forced sterilizations. Let's get real here. Private prisons are contractors. They provide the facilities that the government chooses to use. If there's mismanagement, fix it, improve oversight. But don't throw out the entire system because of isolated cases or activist-driven horror stories. And let's not forget, Democrats had control of the government. If these private facilities were so evil, why didn't they shut them down? Instead, they use these stories to stir up outrage while doing nothing to solve the actual problem. Let's call this what it is. The radical left agenda is about open borders. Jayapal and her allies want to strip IC of funding and detention and give every illegal immigrant a free pass to stay in the country. They don't believe in sovereignty. They don't believe in borders. They believe that everyone should have a right to enter America and stay no matter what the law says. They pretend it's about compassion. But what about the American workers losing jobs to illegal labor? What about the drugs pouring over the border? What about the families who lost loved ones to criminal aliens? You never hear them talk about that. It's always about the so-called trauma of enforcement, never the trauma inflicted on American citizens. Jayapal and her friends also love to throw around accusations of corruption, saying Republicans are profiting off of private prisons or Palantir stocks. But where was this outrage when Democrats were enriching their friends through Solyndra, COVID contracts, or Hunter Biden's shady foreign deals? Give me a break. If there's real corruption, investigate it. But don't pretend that only one side plays a game. And don't use it as an excuse to dismantle our immigration system. At the end of the day, this entire speech by Jayapal is a distraction. It's political theater designed to paint enforcement as evil and illegal immigration as noble. But here's what true patriots know. A nation without borders is no nation at all. Enforcing immigration law is not a crime, it's a duty. Detaining those who break our laws is not cruelty, it's justice. So to Representative Jayapal and the rest of the radical open borders left, we're not sitting on our hands. We're standing up for our country, our laws, and our people. Thanks for watching, Patriots. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video if you're tired of leftist lies and ready to take back America. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.